This morning, we are wrapping up our series, All In. And if you were with us last week, you know, thank you. If you're with us last week, you know that we talked about the areas in our lives that we think we have ownership over. And for many of us, if we look at our lives and we look at those, like we think we own most of our lives. But what we talked about last week was really the areas in our lives that we think we own are actually God's to begin with. Like we are just managing what God has put in our control for a season. And we talked about this verse, the verse that's found in Psalm chapter 24. This is what King David would say. King David would say, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it." So for David, it's pretty clear. Like the earth is God's, everything in the earth is God's. The people who live in earth they are there to serve God. We are stewards. We are managers of some of those resources. Now there are things that it's easier for us to understand and grab a hold of when it comes to that concept. Like when we think about like the earth in itself, like many of us look at it and think, okay, yes, we are stewards of earth. Like God has put us in charge to care for the earth. That's part of what is our responsibility. That's something that might be easier for us to grasp our minds around when it comes to being managers. But there are other areas of our lives that it's a lot more difficult. And one of those areas is when it comes to our finances. When it comes to our finances, we don't do so well at seeing the resources that we have as something that God has entrusted to us and asked us to manage, because the reality is most of us have never been in a position where we're actually managing someone else's resources. And so as we wrapped up last week, I took a risk. And if you weren't here last week, what I did is I put in an envelope and handed out $1 to every single person who was here. And so here's the thing. If you weren't at church last weekend, you missed out. It literally pays to go to church. But there was a catch to those dollars. And I said that last week. And I said, look, when we handed out those dollars, it wasn't the church's money. That myself and my wife, we took our money, we put it in those envelopes, and we gave it to you to hold, to manage, to be stewards of our resources for a week. And for many of you, it might have been the first time in your life that you saw yourself physically holding someone else's money. And I know as I talked to some of you guys this week, it was like, some people are like, I'm going to make sure like it's going to come back and I got it. Like, I'm not going to waste your money. One person told me that they were going to bet on the Super Bowl, that there was 1,000,000-to-1 odds that the Niners were going to win 40-0. And if they did win 40-0, then I'd get 10% of that $1 million. And I was like, wait a second, it's all my dollar. Like, why don't I get all of it? But I pleaded because, I didn't know who was going to win the Super Bowl, but I think I was sane enough to realize the 49ers weren't going to win 40-0. But anyways, so I asked you to hold on to my money, to mine and my wife's money, and to bring it back this week. And so maybe when you walked in, you saw boxes in the back with my picture like this. And it says Mike's money. If you were here last week and you have that money, please do me a favor and drop it off in the back. I told you guys last week that the culmination of all those dollar bills is next month's food budget. So please return my money. And if you weren't here last week, or if this is your first time at Lake Sawyer Church, or if this is your first time at church, let me just tell you, it is not a normal thing for us to have boxes in the back with my picture on it that says Mike's money. It's not a normal thing for people to directly pay the pastor. That is weird, okay? That's not what this is. That's an opportunity for those people that we entrusted with our resources to hold and carry for a week, to give back to us. As I closed last week, I made this point, that until we can understand, as people, until we can understand that we are managers, that we manage the resources that God has entrusted to us, until we can understand that, we will all struggle to go all in with our generosity. And that doesn't matter, no matter how much money that we make. Until we understand that the resources that we have were given to us by God, we will struggle with this topic. And as a part of that, we will feel, and there's a reality, some of us will feel this morning, we will feel like God wants something from us. That God is trying to take something from us. But I want to be very clear, and I'm going to say this a couple times to be abundantly clear, that God doesn't want anything from you. He wants something for you. And in churches, when we give these giving messages, they are not an attempt to take something from you. the attempt is to give something to you, to help you understand the pathway towards freedom, the pathway towards peace that comes from having our finances in order like God calls us to have them in order. And so as I talk this morning, if you feel stuck, like if you're sitting here thinking, well, Mike is trying to take something from me, then I'm going to tell you, you probably need to go back and listen to last week. You probably need to understand and wrestle with this concept of being managers, that you are managers of these resources. You're not owners of these resources. And if you weren't here last week, I would encourage you to go check out that message. That message is going to help you understand a lot the context of what we're going to be talking about this morning. Now, I fully recognize that churches and pastors have abused this topic. I recognize that churches and pastors have used this to their own ends. And I want you to know, if that has been your experience, if you've been a part of a church, if you've been under a pastor who has leveraged this for their own ends, I'm sorry. That is not okay. But I promise you, that's not what this is. This isn't about getting something from you. I'm saying it again. This is about getting something for you. We want you to have peace when it comes to your finances. We want you to experience what it feels like to be able to go all in with your generosity because we know that generous people get so much more from life. This is literally what the research tells us, that generous people live happier and longer lives. This was an exhaustive research study. It wasn't done like for Christians. It wasn't done in churches. It was done in people in general. And this is what they realized. Generous people live happier and longer lives. A couple weeks ago, I read an article from Inc. magazine, and Bill Gates was asked to share, like, what are some of the principles of like happiness? How do you encourage people to experience joy in their life? And what Bill Gates said, he said, look, what I've come to realize is the greatest thing that I can do is give away the money that I have such joy and there's such happiness from blessing others with the resources that I have. Now, of course, we hear that and we're like, yeah, but it's Bill Gates. Like Bill Gates can give away billions of dollars and it won't even affect him. But it's not about the money. It's not about the percent of money. It's not about how much money. It's about the reality. And it shouldn't surprise us that this is what happens, because it's the kind of thing that Jesus calls us to. He calls us to be generous people because he knows that this is the natural outpouring of that. This is what will happen. He calls us to experience the joy that is possible from him. Now, I know that as we unpack some of this, it's going to make a lot of us uncomfortable. And even as I begin to talk about how we can get to the point, how we can get to the place where we can experience some of that joy, some of you might be quick to just shut me out or turn me off. Because I'm going to talk about what God's plan is when it comes to our finances. I'm going to be very upfront here. What I'm about to tell you is not something you've never heard of before. What I'm about to tell you, you know. Even if you've never been in church, you probably know this to be part of what Christians do. It's part of God's plan. And this is what God says his plan is. You take all of the resources that he has entrusted you, that he's entrusted me, that he's entrusted us to manage. You take those resources and you take 10% of it and you give it back to God. And the Bible calls it a tithe. This is what we read in Leviticus chapter 27. A tithe of everything from the land, whether grain from the soil or fruit from the trees, belongs to the Lord. It is holy to the Lord. And so what we read there in the book of Leviticus is that whatever is produced, whatever comes from, whatever comes out of the land, comes out of the labor, a tithe, which is a way of saying a tenth of that, is given to the Lord. It belongs to the Lord. The expectation is abundantly clear. Now, I know as I say this, like immediately there's going to be some objections. There's questions that people ask. One of the questions people ask is, well, okay, does God really need my money? I mean, like, after all, he's God, right? Like, he's created the heavens and the earth. Like, he's created all of this. Like, why does God need my money? And I want to be very clear. God doesn't need your money. But what God wants is God wants your heart. And what we know is what Jesus said. Look what Jesus said. Jesus says, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. I mean, Jesus understood that our heart follows our resources. It's not the other way around. We talked about that a bit last week. Our heart follows after the things that we invest the resources we have in. And so the point is that Jesus doesn't need your money, but he wants your heart. And he knows you will never surrender your heart to him fully unless you're able to surrender a bit of the resources that he's asked you to manage. Now, another question that comes up, maybe not necessarily a question, an objection that comes up, and this objection is only from church people. Only Christians have this objection. It sounds something like this. The tithe is an Old Testament concept, and we are New Testament people. And so the tithe doesn't really apply to us, right? And here's the thing. That's true. That the tithe is an Old Testament principle. It's an Old Testament concept. And that we are New Testament people. But it doesn't mean that we don't take the Old Testament seriously. And one of the things that you'll see when you look at the life and you look at the teachings of Jesus is even though Jesus sees himself as the fulfillment of the law, Jesus never lowers the standards of the law. Just as an example. The law was pretty clear that the people of Israel, who the law applied to, that they were not to commit adultery. Now, Jesus didn't come in and say, hey, that's an Old Testament principle. We are New Testament people. Go ahead and commit adultery. Jesus didn't say that. Jesus said, well, the law says do not commit adultery, but I tell you, if you look at another woman lustfully, you've already committed adultery with her in your heart. This was the law. This is the ethic and the standard he called New Testament people to. Throughout the teachings of Jesus, we see he continually raises the standards for those who place their lives and their hope in him. Now, here's the thing, and I don't say this lightly because I know that this is going to be difficult. The reality is, many of us who ask these questions, most of us who have these objections, we're really just doing it because if we're being perfectly honest, it's that we don't want to give. If we're being perfectly honest, it's because we don't really want to do the thing that God commands us to do. Because there's probably some of us that either A, believes it's ours, it's a huge part of it, or B, somehow believes, well, we know better than God what to do with the resources we've been given. But I look at it and think, well, this is an opportunity. Like, yes, God says he wants 10% of the resources we've been entrusted with. But here's the thing. God also says by that, we get to live off 90% of it. And I know some of you are like, no, I don't think about it that way. I think like God's taking 10%, not that God's blessing me with 90% of it. But it's all about perspective. And this is the best way I can kind of put this, kind of frame this through a story in my own life. Like when I was 16 years old, I got my driver's license. And now, I don't know if any of you, I don't know what age you got your driver's license. I'm sure most of you have your driver's license at this point. Like, when I got my license, it was this incredible moment in my life because I knew, like, I had freedom. Like, there was all these things that I was going to be able to do. Like, I could go wherever I wanted, whenever I wanted. I could do whatever I wanted as long as I was home by 10 p.m. But besides that, like, the world was my oyster. And I just began to dream and envision about all these fun things I'd be able to do with the freedom of having my driver's license. Now, my parents had this their own dream and vision for what it would be like to have a son with a driver's license. And I didn't really understand what their vision was, but I quickly began to understand the reality of that vision because with this license came a responsibility. Like, there was an expectation that my parents had that I would pick up my sister, that I would take her to this place, that I would drop her off here. Like, I became like the family chauffeur. And I never, ever liked that part of it. But the other part of that responsibility, I did enjoy. Like, before it was even a thing, like, I became like the official family Instacart shopper. And my parents, my mom or my dad would often give me a grocery list and send me to the grocery store and give me money. And I would go and I would shop for all those items. And I remember I would come home and I would put the groceries away. And then one of the things I had to do is I had to take the receipt. Don't ever lose a receipt. I had to take the receipt and I had to put my parents' change on the receipt. And I would hand it to them and say, here's your receipt, here's your change. And what do you think my parents said to me often? Keep the change. I loved that. That was like the best, like keep the change. And like sometimes the change was like 73 cents. Sometimes it was a couple bucks, sometimes it was $5, sometimes it was $20. Like the culmination of that change kept gas in my car, it kept McDonald's in my belly. Like this was a good thing. Like I didn't care how much of it I got to keep. It was all gravy that I got to keep any of it. You know what I never did? I never complained. I never said, oh, hold on a second, Dad, listen up. That was my gas in my car with insurance that I pay. It was my time to drive to and from the store, burning my calories, walking up, down the aisle, getting things for you. I did all the work. I put in all the effort. I did it all. And I come back, and how dare you only give me like 30 cents or a couple bucks? You want to know why I never did that? Because I'm smart, right? It would not worked out well for me. But honestly, more than that, like it was like, this is good. Like this is, I don't deserve this, but I get it. And that's the same principle when it comes to God. Like God doesn't say, hey, do the work, do the labor, do it all, and you get to keep 2% of the money. God says you get to keep 90. That you take 10 of it and you trust it to him. It's a heart test. It's a reminder that, hey, where we put our treasure, our heart will follow. You trust it to him, and then you take the 90%, and you get to do whatever you want to do with what's left. God is so generous if you have that perspective. Now, smart financial people would say, well, okay, wait, hold on a second. You might not want to live on 90% because the truth is life happens. Right? Inevitabilities happen. Things break. Like apparently the skies open and the whole world floods. I've heard. And like your roof leaks or like things happen. And when that happens, when unexpected things come up, they bring with them financial pressures, financial realities. And what do we do in those moments if we haven't prepared for them? And so that's why smart financial people would say, okay, be wise, yes, trust God with the 10, but don't just live on the 90. Take a portion of that aside. Save some of it. Prepare for what you know eventually is going to happen. Maybe we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but we all know that something's going to go wrong. Something's going to break. Something unexpected is going to come out of nowhere. The Apostle Paul would say this in 1 Corinthians chapter 16. It's a letter that Paul writes to a church in a city named Corinth. On the first day of every week, payday, each one of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with your income, saving it up. I mean, Paul's like, hey, not even like smart financial people. Paul's like, trust me on this. Like when this time comes, when payday comes, put a piece of your money aside. Pick a percentage. So that as your income grows, so too does that percentage. So too does the amount that you're putting aside for savings. Because we all know that we will have needs. That someone we know will have needs. That we will get in a tough place. And when we're in those places and we haven't done this step, we won't have margin. And so most people will say, give 10, save 10, and then with that 80%, then you can do whatever it is that you want to do with it. And I know as I say that, some people are like, wait a second. Like it was one thing when you're like, hey, I have this money and now apparently I only get to keep 90% of it. But now he's saying like, of all this money, I only actually get to keep like 80% of it. You're probably like elbowing the person you came with like, I told you we shouldn't have come to church today. Oh, come on, let's be honest. It's uncomfortable laughs. Here's the thing. We start to think 80% isn't enough because, man, look at what everyone else has. Oh, look at all that stuff that we want. And so you know what we do? We extend ourselves. Instead of living on 80%, we stretch it to 85%, 95%, 110%, 130%. And that leads to debt. And debt leads to stress. It's no wonder why we struggle to have these conversations. This week I looked up the statistics. I was curious. On average, each American household carries $8,398 in credit card debt. Like that right there, that's why we aren't at peace. That's why that this is a difficult topic. And that's why so many of us start to go down the road, well, if I could just get a little bit more. If I could just get a little bit more, if I could close one more sale, if I could get that second job, if I can do this other thing, the side thing, like if I could just get a little bit more, then we will have what we really need. We'll have the margin that we need. But here's the reality. And you know it, maybe you wouldn't put it this way, but you'll know this to be true in your life. We always find a way to live up to our income. One of like my first real jobs, I made $13,000 a year. And I was like, I am rich. This is amazing. I have like so much money. Like I'm gonna like get the Tesla. I'm gonna get the nice house because I make $13,000 a year. And I thought, but if I could just make a little, like if I could just make like double it, like $26,000 a year, then I could do whatever I wanted. And then I made $26,000. And guess what? I found a way to live up to my income. So I thought, well, if I just make $52,000, if I could just make $52,000, but there's no amount of money that's going to ever fulfill us because we will always find ways to live up to our income. But here's also what we know. When you spend less, you will save more moolah. Yeah. When we spend less, we will save more. So instead of spending all of our time thinking about how we can actually go acquire more money, get more money, we'd be better off looking at the things that we spend and assessing whether or not we really need to spend those things. Now, I fully recognize in this life, in this world, there are obligations that we have, expectations that we place on ourselves. Like we want to provide for our families, like a roof over their heads. We want to provide nutritious meals to feed all of us, to keep our tummies satisfied. Like those are some of the things that we need to do. But then there's all these other things that we spend money on that if we're being honest, like we don't really need to spend money on. And so I actually this week went through and like looked at the things in our budget that we spend money on that we don't need to spend money on, and I'm gonna share them with you. Don't judge me. I don't just have one, but I have 2 gym memberships. I mean, obviously. Some of you are like, you need to go to the gym. You need to use those memberships. You're wasting money. Okay. We have an Apple Music account. We have Netflix, Disney Plus, ESPN Plus, Hulu Plus, Apple, everything's plus, Apple Plus. We spend way too much money on fast food. I know I'm not alone there. I got an Amazon Prime account because I refused to wait 5 days to get a package I didn't have to get off my couch to order. I have an Instacart account because why would I do grocery shopping when someone else can do it for me for free? That's the trick, isn't it? I may or may not have a Xbox Live account because I may or may not play video games. Don't judge me. And I could go on. And I could share all my frivolous financial choices. But needless to say, as I'm realizing as I'm walking through this, I don't have an income issue. I have a spending issue. And my guess is that many of us, if we did the same thing, if we took a serious look at what we spend our money on, we'd realize that to be true. And here's the trick of it all. Like, it all seems so innocent. Like, oh, Disney Plus, $6.99, and like, oh, this is $4.99, and this is $5.99, and oh, $9.99, and then Netflix keeps raising their prices, so like $15. Like, okay, but it's all under 20, and then you add it all up, and you're like, oh, that's a couple $100. Like, that's where it all went. It can be eye-opening, which is why I want to encourage you guys to do that as well. To spend some time this week looking at your resources and figuring it out, what are you spending your money on? And then asking yourself if you really need to spend that money on those things. And then when you do this, this is the thing. I'm going to ask that you would make a decision. That before you figure out whether or not there are valid things, that you would make the decision to prioritize your finances, to prioritize your life around God's plan. Because that's the whole thing. Like, God has a plan for the resources that he's entrusted us with. We've talked a little bit about that. And I think part of the reason why we experience all of this negativity, this awfulness that comes from our finances is because we choose to try to continue down our own path instead of deciding to trust God's plan with our finances. And here's why this is so important. This is what we know, is that financial pressures in people's life lead to debt. And I know as I say that, some of you are like, wow, Mike, that's the least intelligent thing that you've ever said. That's so obvious. Like, obviously spending money that you don't have leads to debt. But then here's what comes with that. Debt is the number one contributor to divorce. And debt is the number one contributor to suicide. And we don't want that for you. God doesn't want that for you. And so we have to decide. Are we going to continue to choose to follow after our plan? Or are we going to trust in God's plan? To give to him what belongs to him, to be willing, if we're overachievers, to save on what's left, and then enjoy everything else. King Solomon, who was a great king for the people of Israel, he would write these words in Proverbs 21. He would say, the wise store up choice food and olive oil, but the foolish gulp theirs down. Solomon says, look, wise people save up. Wise people put things aside. Wise people have a plan. They prioritize God. They put money aside for the inevitabilities, and then they enjoy the rest. And so my challenge to you, my challenge to all of us, is that we would listen to Solomon's words. We would trust in God's plan. We'd make a decision to do God's plan. And we're going to, just for the sake of the rest of our time together this morning, we're going to call it the 100 plan. That 100% of the resources we get to choose what we do with them. And that's one of the things I love about God. You know, God doesn't force us. God doesn't make us. He doesn't show up at our house, knock on our door, and take money away from us. Like, God invites us into this plan. He invites us on the journey. He invites us to surrender our hearts over to him because he knows that this is the only way you'll ever find joy and peace in any of this. So every time you get paid, I'm going to ask that you would take those resources, 100% of them, that you would look at it, and that you would take a tenth of it, and you would give it to God. And I know as I say that, this is the point where it's like someone here is thinking, you promised me that you weren't going to make this about giving to the church. You were going to make this about giving to you. Now you're telling me I got to take a tenth of the resources that are mine and give it to the church. And so I want to be very clear. I'm not telling you to give it here to Lake Sawyer Church. If that's really a hang up for you, if you really think that I'm or this church is trying to get something from you, then I want to be very clear. Don't give it to Lake Sawyer Church. But don't let it be an excuse not to give somewhere. Because that's what a lot of us will do. A lot of us will be like, they're trying to get money from me. I'm not going to give it to them. I'm not going to give them anywhere. Like, no one's going to get my money. Like, we have to be willing to trust God in this area of our lives. And so if it's not this church, I would encourage you, give it to another church. Give it to an organization that is trying to push forward the very things that our master, that God, would want to see done. Find an organization, if it's not here, that values kingdom things. And if it makes you feel good, if that's where your heart aligns, then give there. But I will be honest, my family, we give here to Lake Sawyer Church. And there's some reasons why we do that. We deeply believe in the ministry that's happening here. We deeply believe of what God is doing through this. And I want you to know that when you give here to Lake Sawyer Church, that you are making an impact. You're making a huge impact. That when you give here, there are things that happen. One of the things we talk about this a lot is when people give here to Lake Sawyer, it helps us. It enables us to create environments, to create spaces just like this where people can come and experience Jesus. And that's the most important thing because we know, and many of us have realized this in our own lives, that Jesus changes everything for everyone. And so we want everyone to have an opportunity to experience Jesus. When you give here, one of the other things it does is it helps invest in the next generation. That every weekend we have hundreds of kids out in our children's spaces, and they are getting just a foundation of faith that enables them to walk through life with God's principles in front of them. And I know that there's many of us here, myself included, who wish we had that foundation. And maybe if we did, it would have helped steer us in a different direction from some of the decisions we made growing up. And then tonight, we're going to have high schoolers gathered here in this room. And tonight, they're actually going through a relationship and dating series, and I'm on the panel. So tell your kids to come tonight, or not. It's up to you. But when you give here, you're creating that space for kids, again, to be cared for, to be shepherded, to be pointed in the direction of Jesus. It's an investment in the next generation. Lastly, and we don't ever think of it this way, when you give here to Lake Sawyer, it's an investment in yourself. That you are investing in yourself. You're investing in the work that God is trying to do in your life. That's why I think it is great to give here. But I'm not going to make you give here. I'm not going to make you do it. I am going to encourage you, though wherever it is that you decide to give, I'm going to encourage you to have a plan. Because unless we plan for something, unless we put our just kind of some framework around it, we will never seem to realize it. If we don't plan for what we're going to do with our finances, we will figure out other ways to spend those resources. It's true of me, it's true of my life, it's probably true of what you've experienced in your own life. Everything that we really, really want in life, we put a plan around. This past October, my family and I took a family vacation to where did I go? Mexico. I went somewhere. We went to Mexico with my wife and her whole family, and it was really like 2 years in the making. Like there were some logistical things that we had to figure out because my wife's family is kind of scattered across the U.S., and so we had to figure out how everyone's going to get there and what time everyone's going to show up and leave and all that. But to do a trip like that, it's not like free. So there was also the financial piece to it that we had to plan for, that we had to prepare for because we wanted it to happen, because we knew we needed the means to make it happen. So we put a plan in place to make that dream a reality. And the same is true with our finances. If there isn't a plan, then it won't see fulfillment. This is what Solomon says, that same Solomon that we just talked about in a few verses, but in the same chapter in 21. He says, the plans, many of us aren't going to like this verse, the plans of the diligent lead to profit, as surely as haste leads to poverty. Now here's the thing, if you don't like this verse doesn't settle well with you, here's the good news. It's not my fault. I'm just reading Solomon's words. It's Solomon's fault. Now, even though this is not my fault, be honest, it is my reality. Because I have a tendency to be hasty. I have a tendency to want something, to desire something. So I figure out a way to go after it. And maybe I can't afford it now, but I'll just figure that out later. So I buy it now, and when the bills come, we'll sort that out later. In haste, I act. And I know that about myself, which is why I've had to be diligent. Why as a family, we've had to be diligent in creating a plan to prioritize the 100 plan in our life, to prioritize God's plan for our finances. So make a plan. Figure out someplace. Where are you going to give? What are you going to do with the 10% of your resources that God has entrusted you to carry? Where are you going to give it that perpetuates his values? And like I said, I think I've made a case. Look, I think you should give to Lake Sawyer. I think it's a great place. And if you want to give to Lake Sawyer, this is where you can do it. You go to lakesawyerchurch.org/give. And on that website, you can create an automated plan, which is what we do. We literally let the machines take it before we can figure out another way to spend it. And maybe someone's like, well, no, like machines shouldn't take the money. Like you should like write a check. I don't care. Like it's the act of it going out of my hands that reminds me that it's not mine to begin with. And so if you want to give here to Lake Sawyer, this is a great place for you to do it and to set up an automated plan. And here's the other promise I'll say to you. If you choose to give somewhere else, and you don't want to give here because you think we're trying to take your money. If you want to give somewhere else, I can promise you, you can go to their website. And on their website, there will be some sort of give tab, donate tab. And there will be a way for you on that website to set up a plan. Do it. And if there's an organization that you want to do it and you can't figure it out, I really mean this. call me. Come in. I will walk through it together with you. I will help you set up a plan someplace else because I want this for you. I want you to experience freedom. I want you to experience peace. And I know it won't happen unless you can place your finances under God's plan. Now, I know as we talk about this and all of this, we talk about doing a spending plan and looking at where your money goes and then giving 10% back to God. I know as I say this, like there's stress for a lot of us. Because the reality is we're looking at our finances, and even as we look at all the expenses, we might get to the end of it and go, like literally there's not 10% that I can give to God. Like I can't physically make it happen. And so here's what I would say. If you can't give 10% back to God, this might be the most important thing I say this morning, so I want to make sure you hear this. If you can't give 10% back to God, He still loves you. He still sent His Son to die for you. You are His prized, cherished possession. He loves you. This isn't a legalism thing. God loves you. If you can't give 10% of your income, give something. Make it 1%. Make it 2%. Pick a percent. Trust it to God and see what He can do and see how He can grow it from there. Now, I also realize that there's some of us in this room who we look at it from a legalistic perspective on the other end, right? We're like 10%, check, quota met, now I'm good. When in actuality, God has actually given us the means to go far above and beyond that 10%. So if God has given you the ability to give more, by all means, give it. Be more generous. Give more back to God because you've realized maybe you don't need 80%. Maybe with where you're at financially, you only need 50%. And now you can bless the rest to God and the work that He's trying to do in people's lives. Now, for us to get to this point, I'm almost done because I know some people are like, is he ever going to finish talking about money? Maybe. Close the doors. Turn on the heat. I'm kidding. For us to get to this place, for us to get to a place where we can follow after God's plan, there are some barriers. There are some hurdles that we have to overcome. And so I want to talk about it. Here's just a few barriers to the 100 plan. The barrier to giving is greed. We don't like the word, but let's be honest, most of us are greedy people. Most of us see more, want more, try to acquire more, and we pursue that, we prioritize that, and so we have nothing left to give. It's a barrier for us. Another barrier to saving is debt. Because we're greedy, because we try to go get more, then we get to the next month and we don't have enough money to pay the previous month and then to live that month, and so we rack up debt. And we're in a tough financial position and we're playing from behind. The last barrier is this. The barrier to spending is discontentment. The barrier to being in the place, the position, where you can joyfully live off the 80% that you have been left with is discontentment. Because, again, more. We like more. We want more. But here's the thing. God says His plan isn't just about barriers. God says His plan is about blessing. So here's the blessing of the 100 plan. That when you give, you will give joy. Giving will give you joy. And that's why I said first hour, I messed up my words. I said, this year we pay taxes. And I'm like, wait, every year we pay taxes. But as we're going over some of our tax statements in the coming months, like we get our charitable contributions. And when you see those things roll in, I can promise you, I've never looked at those and been like, waste of money. Like I don't see the ways that we've been able to give and bless others and think of it as a waste. I see it as a thing of joy. Like look at what we've been able to do. Like some of the greatest stories I've been able to tell my kids is like, hey, because as a family we make these sacrifices, kids get clean water. Or this family gets shelter. Like these are joyous moments to share as a family. Giving will give you joy. I promise you that. Next one, saving will give you peace, and we all need a little bit more peace. Lastly, spending will give you freedom. When you pick and choose God's plan, when you follow what God calls us to do, I promise you will not spend out of guilt. You will spend, and it will bring you freedom. All of it, I'm wrapping up. All of it is His. And the truth is we only have it for a short period of time. And if we could just for a second, step back from the madness of our finances. If we could just for a second take a deep breath, get just a little bit of separation from the bills, I think all of us would say that we want more from life than just more stuff. Like we want to leave a legacy. We want to do something that's going to change someone else's life. And I promise you, that's what God's plan does. It will not only change someone else's life, but it will change your life. It will bring more joy than you've ever experienced. It will bring more peace than you've ever experienced. It will bring more freedom than you've ever experienced when it's come to the resources you've been entrusted to manage. And that freedom, that joy, that peace is not only what God wants for you, but it's what I want for you. But only you can decide. Only you can choose what plan that you will follow. Is it God's plan? Or is it the same plan that you've been trying to follow for years? My guess is if you chose this one, it probably hasn't led you to the place you wanted to be. But I promise you, if you choose God's plan, it will lead you to the place where you need to be. A place where you can finally go all in with your generosity. Let's pray. God, sometimes when I think of the things that you call us to, if I'm being honest, God, I don't like it. And I think this is one of those topics for many of us that we just don't like. And it's probably one of those topics that we're quick to just grab a hold of and to remove you from the conversation. And God, I think because we do that, it leads to a lot of pain, hurt, frustration, stress. And so God, I pray that we would be the kind of people that would choose a different way, that we would trust that even as you speak life to us in other areas of our life, that what you have to say about finances would bring freedom. So God, I pray that we'd be willing to entrust you with that, to give back to what is yours as the first thing we do, so that our heart follows after it, and that our heart follows after you. And because we do that, God, from that we would have joy and peace and ultimately freedom. So we thank you. We thank you for the calling and the ways you ask us to be better, even in the areas of the life that make us extremely uncomfortable. And we entrust you with this. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.